The light on trial, the prophetic testimony and the rejection of Christ in John 8. John 8 presents itself not as a collection of sayings, but as a sustained confrontation over the conditions under which divine truth may be recognized. When Jesus declares, "I am the light of the world," in John 8:12, he is not offering a poetic description of moral guidance or spiritual insight. In Johannine theology, light functions as the condition of intelligibility itself. Light is that by which things are disclosed and what they truly are. To claim to be the light of the world is therefore to claim to be the decisive locus of God's self-revelation. John 8 puts on trial not Jesus' character and not even his divinity in the abstract. It puts on trial the question of how divine truth is recognized at all. If you misunderstand that question, everything that follows in this chapter will be misread. The response from the Pharisees immediately frames the claim in judicial terms. You are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. This is not a casual dismissal. It is an appeal to Torah. Under Mosaic law, self-attestation is insufficient to establish truth. A claim of this magnitude requires corroboration. From the outset, the dispute concerns testimony, admissibility, and authority. This is important to see. The Pharisees are not being unreasonable here. According to the law, self-testimony is insufficient. They are applying a real standard. The problem is not that they appeal to the law. The problem is what kind of witness they think the law permits. Jesus does not reject the standard they invoke. Instead, he exposes the limitation of their evaluative framework. Even if I testify about myself, my testimony is true because I know where I come from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from or where I am going. The issue is not procedural correctness, but epistemic access. Jesus' origin is revelatory rather than empirical. It cannot be adjudicated by criteria restricted to present observation, institutional verification, or human continuity. He then explicitly invokes the second witness required by the law. In your law, it has been written that the testimony of two men are true. I am the one who testifies about myself, and the Father who sent me testifies about me. The legal requirement is met. Two witnesses are named. Yet the response exposes the deeper problem. Where is your Father? John 8:19. The question reveals a categorical failure. It assumes that legitimate testimony must appear within the same temporal or spatial register as human witnesses. The Father's testimony is being sought as though it were a contemporaneous presence rather than a prior word. Jesus' reply identifies the consequence of this assumption. You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. The Father's testimony is neither private nor mystical. Jesus does not appeal to an inward voice, a personal vision, or an immediate divine endorsement. The Father testifies through the prophetic word spoken beforehand and now enacted in history. This has already been established earlier in the Gospel. Moses wrote of him. The Scriptures testify about him. The works given to him correspond to what was foretold. The Father's witness is public, historical, and prior. It is absent. It is unrecognized. Jesus identifies the governing limitation with precision. You judge according to the flesh. John 8:15. Flesh here does not denote immorality, but finitude. Judgment is being exercised according to what is immediately available: visible authority, institutional continuity, lineage, and present confirmation. Such judgment can evaluate teachers and movements. It cannot recognize a revelation whose authority lies in fulfilled promise rather than present display. Judging according to the flesh doesn't mean judging wickedly. It means judging only by what is visible, present, and institutionally verifiable. That kind of judgment can assess teachers, movements, and traditions. It cannot recognize a revelation whose authority lies in fulfilled promise rather than present display. As the discourse continues, Jesus does not attempt to force recognition through argument. Instead, he locates understanding in an event yet to come. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own initiative, but speak these things as the Father taught me. Jesus does not say, you will understand once I explain this better. He says understanding will come after an event. Fulfillment doesn't add new information. It vindicates what has already been spoken. This emphasis on being taught reinforces the structure of testimony. Jesus does not function as an independent revelator introducing novel claims. He speaks as one instructed. His authority derives from perfect continuity with the Father's prior self-disclosure. He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. The Father's presence is not emotional reassurance, but covenantal alignment with the prophetic intent now being carried out. Even belief, however, proves unstable when detached from this same center. As the conversation shifts toward Abrahamic identity, lineage is introduced as a competing ground of authority. Descent becomes the credential by which truth is measured. Jesus reframes Abraham himself as a man constituted by response to divine speech rather than biological continuity. Abraham's defining feature is not ancestry, but orientation towards promise. This leads Jesus to articulate the decisive fracture. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. The inability is not intellectual, but dispositional. Hearing requires submission to the prophetic word as authoritative revelation. Resistance to Jesus is therefore not merely personal rejection. It is the rejection of messianic prophecy as a mode of divine self-disclosure that carries binding authority. This is where almost every reading collapses into oversimplification. Before Abraham was, I am, is not a mere claim to longevity. If that is all you hear, you have already missed what makes this statement explosive. Now, this is the expanded clarification on John 8:58 in pre-existing authority before we move on. When the discourse reaches its climax with Jesus' declaration, before Abraham was, I am, the statement must not be flattened into a merely chronological claim. It certainly includes preexistence, but not in the reduced sense of personal duration prior to birth. The claim is about preexistent authority, not simply preexistent being. Within Second Temple Judaism, the idea of preexistence was neither foreign nor scandalous in itself. Jewish theology already possessed categories for preexistent realities: wisdom, Torah, the name, the glory, the word, for example. Moreover, the expectation of a pre-existent Messiah was not universally rejected. The two powers in heaven discourse demonstrates that many Jews were already grappling with the presence of a divine distinguishable agent who shared in God's authority without collapsing into polytheism. The crisis, therefore, is not that Jesus claims preexistence. The claim is how that preexistence is disclosed and where its authority is located. Abraham functions in John 8 as the foundational anchor of religious legitimacy. To appeal to Abraham is to appeal to the origin point of covenantal identity, lineage, promise, and inheritance. By asserting priority over Abraham, Jesus is not merely claiming that he existed earlier in time. He is claiming that the authority by which Abraham himself was constituted as Abraham precedes him. The word that called Abraham, defined him, and gave him his identity did not originate in Abraham's history. It stands above it. Abraham is not the foundation of revelation, he is the product of it. The word that called Abraham is the authority Jesus is identifying himself with here. That is what places him before Abraham. Hear how the Scriptures themselves testify to this pre-existent word. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way before his works of old. I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done. These texts do not describe a late arriving message. They describe a word that precedes history, orders history, and speaks before history begins. These texts do not describe a late arriving message. They describe a word that precedes history, orders history, and speaks before history begins. And what is that word? It is messianic prophecy itself. This is why the statement is revelatory and epistemic. Jesus is asserting the very framework by which religious legitimacy is measured. Lineage, descent, covenantal continuity derives its authority from a word that transcends time and history. That word is not an impersonal principle. It is not a static decree. It is the living, self-consistent speech of God that unfolds across generations and reaches its fullness in embodiment in Jesus. In other words, the pre-existence Jesus claims is not merely personal. It is trans-temporal. It is the authority of revelation itself. He is not presenting himself as a teacher who happens to predate Abraham. He is identifying himself with the revelatory voice by which Abraham was called in the first place. This is where the true offense lies. The Pharisees are willing, at least in principle, to acknowledge a pre-existent Messiah. What they are unwilling to confess is that the pre-existent prophetic word, the word that speaks through time, binds God to his promises and governs the meaning of history, could take the form of humiliation, rejection, suffering, and execution. They are not rejecting divinity. They are rejecting a God who binds himself to a prophetic script that includes humiliation, rejection, and death. A word may predict suffering. It may not rule through it. Their resistance is not to transcendence, but to the mode of transcendence God chose. They are prepared for a Messiah whose preexistence manifests as visible power, institutional authority, or immediate vindication. They are not prepared for a Messiah whose preexistence is expressed through fidelity to a prophetic script that includes debasement, contradiction, and death. This is why the prophetic word becomes the stumbling block. To accept Jesus' claim would require confessing the same transcendent authority that existed before Abraham also authored Isaiah 53, Psalms 22, and Zechariah 12:10, among many others. and that this authority intended to reveal itself precisely through what appears weak, cursed, and rejected. Thus, the failure of John 8 is not a failure to recognize divinity in the abstract. It is a refusal to grant full divine authority to the prophetic word itself, to messianic prophecy itself as a stream of revelation over our faith and over the church. The word is permitted to predict. It is not permitted to rule. It is allowed to speak beforehand. It is not allowed to define the terms of fulfillment. Jesus' declaration, "Before Abraham was, I am," therefore names the deepest point of rupture. It asserts that the voice now speaking is the same voice that spoke before Abraham, through Abraham, and beyond Abraham. To reject that voice is not to reject a man claiming too much authority. It is to reject the very principle by which God has chosen to make himself known across time. The claim is that the prophetic word, by which Abraham himself was called and defined, precedes Abraham. Abraham does not stand as the origin of revelation. He stands as its recipient. The word that constituted Abraham now stands embodied before them. The implication is unmistakable. Prophetic revelation is not secondary or provisional. It is divine in authority and determinative in identity. This implication provokes the final reaction. They picked up stones to throw at him. The violence is not a response to abstract metaphysics. It is a response to the collapse of a carefully maintained hierarchy in which prophecy, that is messianic prophecy, may predict, but it must never rule. May prepare, but must never define. To grant the prophetic word equal authority with God himself would require a radical reconfiguration of religious epistemology. John 8 thus exposes a pattern that extends far beyond its immediate setting. God may be confessed, Scripture revered, and Christ named as light. Yet once messianic prophecy is displaced from its central testimonial role, authority migrates elsewhere, to tradition, to doctrine, to experience and feeling and emotion, to intuition, to morality, or institutional continuity. Each can sustain a religious identity. None can bear the transcendent, preexistent weight of the Father's testimony. At this point, it's possible to agree with everything I've said and still miss the danger John 8 exposes. Because the failure in this chapter is not atheism. It is not skepticism. It is not even hostility to God. It is the quiet displacement of the prophetic word from its governing role. The Pharisees do not deny Scripture. They do not reject Abraham. They do not deny that God has spoken. What they refuse is to allow that word, once fulfilled, to define reality, authority, and identity. And that same refusal is still possible now. A church can confess Christ, revere the Bible, defend doctrine, preserve tradition, and cultivate moral seriousness, and still quietly relocate authority away from messianic prophecy that testifies to him. When that happens, faith slowly changes shape. Trust becomes agreement. Obedience becomes behavior management. Assurance becomes psychological confidence. And Christ becomes someone who must be continually justified by outcomes, usefulness, growth, and relevance. But the faith John 8 demands is different. It is not faith in an abstract divinity. It is faith in a word that bound God to humiliation, rejection, contradiction, and death, and then fulfilled it. To believe that word is not merely to accept information about Christ. It is to submit to the authority of revelation itself. It is to allow the prophetic testimony to govern how God may reveal himself, even when that revelation contradicts expectation, power, and religious instinct. The church is preserved only where that submission remains intact, not where Christ is admired, not where Scripture is quoted, not where morality is enforced, but where the fulfilled word is allowed to rule. John 8 shows us what happens when messianic prophecy is permitted to speak but not to decide. And it shows us why the light of the world is still on trial. Not only belief, not only before institutions and traditions, but in the posture of faith itself. Well, a major theme of this is that the light is still on trial. I want you to take care and not miss a point of all this. Whenever I say that the prophetic word must not be relegated, downgraded, put aside, or put in second place, what I'm saying is I'm saying messianic prophecy itself must not be. That is the point. And when I say messianic prophecy itself, I'm not talking to only someone's assent that, yeah, sure, messianic prophecy, Jesus fulfilled the prophets. No. I'm talking about the knowledge that is required in order for you to make that judgment rightly, to make it righteously before God. You can't just make some kind of belief claim. You can't just go around saying, I believe in Jesus because of Jesus fulfilled the prophets, and not have any knowledge about exactly what he fulfilled. It's impossible. If you think that you're doing this is nothing but you basically posing and faking it. The point of all this is, from pulpits all over the world, we have to change how we preach radically. Because if you look at something like a Billy Graham sermon, which is prototypical of all of our evangelism today, even in the Catholic Church, by the way, and sometimes especially in the Catholic and Orthodox Church, you will see a series of nothing but claims and propositions. Believe this, believe that, believe this, believe that. And all these people are being taught to believe in propositions. They're taught to believe in statements, and they're taught to believe in ideas, religious ideas and concepts. That doesn't save. It's not righteous, and it's lying. It's lying to everyone that you're preaching to, and it's teaching them to lie about themselves. And then when they go out and preach, they do the same thing, and they continue the lie. In order for you to believe a proposition, you have to know the knowledge and the facts that lead up and make that proposition true. If you're going around saying, I believe in Jesus, and you don't know the prophecies and the word that he died to fulfill and why, then you have no faith. It's not faith. I'm sorry. It's faith in the 21st century sense. It's faith in the post-enlightenment sense of religious faith that does not need any corroboration or any facts. It's just a leap. But this is not Hebrew. It's not biblical. It's not Jesus's faith. And if we read the New Testament from the beginning, we will come to this very firm conclusion. There can be no way around it. Faith requires knowledge, and it requires you to reach a certain conclusion that God requires from that knowledge. You have to have both. You can't have one and not have the other.